everybody. Thank you for coming. When I wrote this show, I had no idea how timely this is going to be. This was going to be. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. So it's Christmas Day, and I am sitting on the couch talking to my grandfather. As a matter of fact, here's a picture right here, me and my husband talking to my grandfather. Now, the reason why this Christmas Day was so special was because this was the first time that I was spending Christmas with my grandfather. Now, it was such a lovely day. I felt like I was talking to a unicorn because I, I was just meeting him, and I was just meeting him for the very first time. Now, as we sat there talking, I felt kind of sad because since I had never met him before, I wish that we had more time together. But you know that old saying, better late than never. And so I was getting the most out of being there. Now, we were having such an amazing time. He's telling me stories. I'm telling him stories. As a matter of fact, we had basically a century's worth of information to catch up on. So we're sitting there and we're talking and we're laughing and we're having a great time. And all of a sudden, my grandfather gets this very serious look on his face. And he says to me, "Son, I have something that I need to tell you. And I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I just have to do it." So I looked at him and I wondered what was wrong. "Well, grandfather, you know what? You can tell me anything." And he says, "I don't know. I think if I tell you this, you will probably want to leave. And if you get up and leave, I will fully understand." Okay, so now I really wanted to know. So my grandfather sits back, he looks me in the eyes, and he says to me, "Son, I killed a white man once." Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, I wasn't expecting that. In my mind is like racing a mile a minute. Oh my God, I think he just told me that he killed someone. Did he just say that he killed someone? But as my mind is racing, I had to look as non-judgmental as possible. So I kept myself calm, and I thought for a second, and I thought, all right, Les, don't react. And so I put on my best serious face, and I say to him, "Okay, go on, tell me the story." And my grandfather begins his story. But I'm going to interrupt the story for a second. Okay, so you guys out there, show of hands, how many of you guys grew up without grandparents? Anybody? All right, I see a few. Okay, great. All right. Yeah, I did too. Now, growing up on my mom's side, her parents died before I was born. But on my father's side, my father was estranged from his family. And so as a matter of fact, his parents divorced when he was a child. And let's just say that his parents weren't ready to be parents yet. So they gave my father and his sister to my grandmother's parents, and they went on about their lives and lived their lives. And so my father basically considered his grandparents like his parents. And he considered my grandparents, his mom and dad, kind of like two cousins, very distant cousins, who he didn't like very much. So after his grandparents died, it was basically like his mom and dad died. Now, I did meet my grandmother once, all right? And she didn't like me. How did I know she didn't like me? Because she told me. I remember I was about 6 years old. And so I go walking into the living room one morning, and there's this lady sitting on our couch. And she says, "Hi, I'm your grandma. Give me a hug." I didn't want to give her a hug. I didn't know her. And so she looks at me and she tells me that I'm like this evil child. But I mean, come on. My dad was so distant from his parents. This was the first I had heard that I even had a grandmother. He never talked about her. He never had any pictures of her. So the strange lady is there and she's like, "I'm your grandma. Love me, love me, love me." And because of that, she called me an evil child. So didn't get to know her very well. Didn't get to know her at all. She left and she never came back. And I never saw her again. I gotta be honest with you guys though, I was always envious of my friends who had grandparents. You know, I would always hear my friends talk about how their grandfathers would tell them corny jokes and how their grandmothers would get them ugly socks for Christmas. And I wanted that. I wanted that just like they did because I felt like I was totally just missing out on something. So when I was a couple of years ago, I had a milestone birthday. 50. And when I had this milestone birthday, I had what you would call an existential crisis. You know, what's this all about? What's life all about? Where am I from? Who am I? And so I decided to do two things. The first thing was something that I always wanted to do. I decided to trace my roots. So when I was a little kid, there was a mini series called Roots. And this actually was like the very first miniseries. It was on 7 nights in a row, and every little Black kid across America was forced to sit down and watch this miniseries. And every night, I learned more and more about history. So for those of you who don't know about Roots, Roots was a book written by Alex Haley, who was this Black author, and he traced his life from the 70s through slavery times back to Africa. And I was fascinated with this. Now, I gotta be honest with you though, watching Roots kind of screwed me up a little bit. Literally, not only was every Black person in this mini-series Roots, every TV actor in Hollywood was on this TV show Roots. And so you guys remember Robert Reed, Mr. Brady from the Brady Bunch? So Robert Reed, America's dad, played a slave owner. So watching Robert Reed beat the shit out of JJ's dad from Good Times really just pushed me over the edge. Seriously. Oh, and not only did he beat him up, he chopped his foot off too. So that scarred me with Robert Reed for life. But I always wanted to find my roots. I always wanted to find out my African heritage. I always wanted to find out where I was from. And then the second thing that I wanted to do was I wanted to find my grandfather so that I could have a grandparent, because I still felt that that was the one thing that I was missing from my life. So how was I going to find my roots? By taking an ancestry DNA test. So I got an ancestry DNA kit and I filled up the tube. It's kind of gross. You got to spit in this tube. And I filled up the tube and I mailed it to Ancestry.com. And then I proceeded to look for my grandfather. And I found him. And it was a lot easier than I thought. My grandfather was actually living in a suburb of New Orleans with his stepdaughter. And so I get a hold of him. And when I get a hold of him, it's like we had known each other for my entire life. We were talking, we were laughing, we were having a great time. And I say to him, you know what? I'd love to see you. And he says, yes, I'd love for you to visit me too. And so I first said, hey, why don't I come visit you next summer? And he says, Les, I'm 99 years old. I don't know how much time I have left. You better come as soon as you can. And so that's when I decided that my grandfather and I were going to spend our very first Christmas together. So once we made those plans, I soon got my ancestry results back. And I was ready because I was ready to find out my African roots. I was ready to find out where I was from. And here we go. Here are the results. You guys ready? So the first African country that I was from was Nigeria. Yay! The second African country that I was from was Cameroon. Yay! The next African country that I was from is England. Yay. Okay, the next African country that I'm from is France. Okay, the next African country that I'm from is Ireland. Okay, now you guys are just fucking with me. The next African country that I'm from is Sweden. And then, okay, the next African country that I'm from is Norway. And okay, whatever. Next African country is Russia. And then the final African country really was an African country, Mali. So I sat back and I wondered, how the hell did this happen? Seriously, how did this happen? And then I realized, well, you know what? I do have a weird last name after all. Maybe that has something to do with it. Okay, so you guys have a confession to make. My last name is Kurkendaal, right? But the spelling of Kurkendaal isn't what you think it is. I literally zhuzhed up my last name for Hollywood. So the original spelling of my last name, Kurkendaal, is Kuykendall. Kurkendaal. But I guess you guys are all wondering, where is the R? Okay, that last name and that question has been the bane of my existence since I was 5 years old and went to kindergarten. No one ever pronounced my last name right. You know, they pronounced it Kurkendaal, Kurkendaal, Kurkendaal. And when I would correct them and say Kurkendaal, they would go, it's not Kurkendaal, there's no R, it's Kurkendaal. Even my husband, I got married and we decided to hyphen our last names. And for the longest time, my husband would introduce himself as Les Kurkendaal-Barrett. And I'm like, dude, it's your goddamn name. Say it properly. It's Kurkendaal. So when I asked my father about our last name, he told me this story of, well, you know, it is Dutch. And so we probably got our last name from slave traders. Well, that's not the case. So back to my grandfather's story. We're sitting there on the couch And I'm hanging on my grandfather's every word. And I'm dying to find out, how did he get into this situation where he had to kill a guy? So we're talking, and first my grandfather is telling me about his history. So as a little kid, he was always bored. And he always craved adventure. So when he was around 13 years old, he started doing things like running away from home and catching boxcars on freight trains and riding across the United States and living like a hobo. And I asked him, why'd you decide to do that? And he said, because I could. By living as a hobo, he had the time of his life. And he would show up at home every now and then, and it didn't seem like it fazed his mom very much, because he'd show up at home and his mom would be like, oh, hey, you're back. So when he was about 14 years old, the circus came to town where he lived. And when the circus left town, my grandfather left with that circus. He literally ran away with the circus. And so for an entire year, he worked at the circus and he did manual labor and he cleaned up after animals. But he said that that was the time of his life. Why? Because he had the freedom and he had the fun. So his mother died and his life got dark. And then his father died and his life got darker. And he started getting into trouble. And he thrived off of getting into trouble. And him getting into trouble is how he ended up in the place where he shouldn't have been. Now, meanwhile, I'm looking at my ancestry results and I'm trying to get to the bottom of this. Now, the cool thing about Ancestry.com is that it's set up so that you can actually meet people who you're related to. So I'm sitting at the computer and I'm looking at all these names of people, and next to all these names or people are their pictures. And as I go down the list, I see black person, black person, black person, black person, lighter skin black person, lighter skin black person, even lighter skin black person, brunette white person, blonde white person, redhead white person who looks a lot like Pippi Longstocking. Okay. So I wrote them all an email, and the email says, heading, well, this is interesting. Hi, my name is Les, and we came up as a match on Ancestry DNA. Well, this is interesting. I bet you're wondering how the hell this happened. I'm wondering the same thing. So if you want to meet and find out, get a hold of me and we can find out together. So the very first person who answered my email was my cousin Michael. Here's Michael right here. And Michael's my fourth cousin. And it turned out that Michael and I were going to be in New Orleans at the same time. And so we decided to meet. So I walk into the coffee house that's across the street from my hotel. And I meet Michael, very kind looking man. And we sit down and we start to talk. And he asks me, how much do you know about your Arsenault side of the family? And I say to him, nothing, which was true. The only thing that I knew about my Arsenault side of the family was that my great-grandmother's last name was Arsenault, but that was it. And so Michael looks at me and he says, you better sit down and get comfortable because we got a lot of information to cover. So we start out with Duke Abraham Arsenault, who was born in Paris, France in 1614. Excuse me, did you say Duke Abraham Arsenault? Like Duke, like French nobility, Duke? Okay, this means that I'm descended from French nobility. All right, you know what? This answers so many questions. My sense of entitlement, my bad attitude, my love for too much champagne and stinky cheese explains it right here. Duke Abraham Arsenault was very good friends with King Louis XV. As a matter of fact, Duke Arsenault was in charge of Louis XV's arsenal, hence the last name Arsenault. Now, he and Louis XV were such great friends that Louis gave Duke Abraham a parcel of land in a little place called New France, which would later be called Louisiana. As a matter of fact, the Arsenaults were one of the first families to set up a home and a plantation and a business in Louisiana. So Duke Arsenault builds this plantation and he stays in France, but he runs the plantation from France, right? And then he has a son named Francois Arsenault, and Francois decides he doesn't like living in France anymore, so Francois moves to Quebec. And Francois then has a son named Michel Arsenault I, and Michel decides that he doesn't like living in Quebec, so then Michel moves to Nova Scotia, where he has Michel Arsenault II. I look at Michael then and I say, wait a minute. So there were 3 generations in Canada. Wait, we're Canadian? Really? So Michel Arsenault II gives birth to Michel Arsenault III. And this is, get ready, because this is where stuff gets crazy. So I actually talked to Michael on the phone last night, and Michael he's a great genealogist, and he found these records. Get this. So in 1747, Michel Arsenault at the time had slaves, right? But in 1747, this is what Michel Arsenault did, and this is what he wrote. I have a total of 1,200 freed slaves. There are 150 adult males and 150 females, which make up these families. And these families have 900 children. Get ready for this, because this is really cool. When we buy a slave, he's promised a share of income from the plantation. And he can use that income to buy his and his family's freedom. Whatever I paid for the family is what he pays me in that amount, and I free him and the family. Now, all families are now free, and when they're free, they can stay on the land and live on the land and work. And he says, if they leave, I will always buy others. 1/3 of the income from the plantation goes for expense, 1/3 goes to me, and 1/3 goes to the slaves. And it has been proven to be most successful. No shit, they were free. So then he goes on to say, I have a school for the slave children and their parents. Now you guys got to realize this back then, it was illegal for a Black person to know how to read. And you'd be severely punished for being caught teaching a Black person how to read. But yes, he has a school for the slave children and their parents. I want all of them to read and write and be educated. Now, there are a lot of people who don't agree with me, but I want to leave the world better than we found it. Yes, that is my grandfather. So Michel Arsenault now moves to Louisiana. And he's running the plantation from Louisiana, and he has another son. And then his son gives has a son named Charles Gustave Arsenault, and this is where shit gets very real. Because Charles Gustave Arsenault, otherwise known as Gustave, kept up the family tradition of anti-slavery, but he took it one step further because he not only fell in love with a slave, he married her. And after they got married, they had two boys, Theodore and Louis. So Louis was the fairer complected of the two. And Louis went on to marry a white woman named Anne Darby, and they had two daughters. And their two daughters were light enough to be able to pass for white people. So they went and lived as white people. Now, back then, there was something called passing, where if you were light enough to pass as a white person, you did it. And a lot of times when they would do that, they literally would ghost the family, they would leave the family, nothing. Theodore, on the other hand, fell in love and married a biracial woman named Mary Key. Now, there is a rumor that Mary Key's father, Harry Key, had a very famous father. Now, it's a rumor and it's being investigated, so I will say allegedly, but allegedly, Harry Key had a very famous father. I will give you a hint. Oh, say, can you see? Yes, allegedly, Francis Scott Key, the guy who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, is a grandfather of mine. Anyway, Theodore and Mary had kids, and they had a daughter named Louise Arsenault, who met a man named Lorenzo Kurkendaal, who then had a son named Lester Kurkendaal I, who then had a son named Lester Kurkendaal II, who then had a son named Lester Kurkendaal III, otherwise known as me. Ta-da! Back to my grandfather. So, my grandfather's telling me the story, and I am all in, right? So my grandfather says that when he got a little older, he would sometimes pass as white. And as I was looking at my grandfather, and as he was talking, I noticed that he had blue eyes. But even though he had blue eyes and he was fair complected, his hair texture was like mine. But if he put on a hat, people would mistake him for maybe being Spanish or Italian. And so he would pass as white, and he would go to places that he wasn't supposed to be. And I asked him, why did you do that? And he says, because I could. That's why. So he would visit Mississippi a lot. And there was this one bar in Mississippi that he loved to go to. It was a whites only bar, and he would throw on a hat and he would go to this bar and he would sit at the bar and he would have drinks. And the danger of being in a bar where he's not supposed to be was just very thrilling to him. So one day he's at the bar and he's having drinks. And as he's having his drinks, he looks up and he sees in the mirror behind the bar a guy, and this guy is staring at him. He starts to feel a little uneasy. And so he decides that he's going to drink his beer as fast as possible, and he's going to get the hell out of there. So he's drinking his beer, and he looks at the mirror behind the bar, and the guy's a little closer. And then he looks up again, and the guy is closer. And before he knows it, the guy smacks his hat off of his head. Everybody could now see that my grandfather was actually black. And before he knew it, somebody was yelling, "Watch out, he's got a knife." Now, meanwhile, back at Ancestry, another cousin got a hold of me. And this is my cousin, Travis. Now, Travis lives in Las Vegas. And so when I first got a hold of Travis and we were talking on the phone, Travis says, okay, wait a minute. You're black, right? Yeah. And he says, oh, okay, because I have a lot of relatives in Louisiana and they're kind of racist. And then I say, well, I guess they're kind of in for a surprise because they've got black relatives, a lot of them. Now, it turns out that that Travis is actually a descendant of Louis Arsenault, the side of the family that the daughters went and pretended to be white. He's a descendant of them. So we're talking, and it turns out that Travis is actually what you would call an influencer. He's an internet celebrity. Now, on the internet, he's known of as the balance guru. And the cool thing is he literally like balances on stuff. Like, for example, he has this one viral video where he has two grocery baskets and he is like upside down on these grocery baskets. He has this other video where he literally has a weight that weighs 100 pounds. And while holding this weight, he jumps up on a medicine ball and balances on a medicine ball. Now, his biggest claim to fame is that he is the Guinness Book World Record holder of the highest handstand. Bad ass. So Travis and I are talking and we're getting along. And I do what a lot of people who live in Los Angeles do, which is, as we're talking, I say to him, hey, if you're ever in LA, give me a call. You can always crash on my couch. 2 days later, I get a phone call. Hey, I'm going to be in LA in a couple of days. Can I crash at your place? So I meet up with Travis. And he's like about my height with a much better body. And we immediately click. We get along. We're sitting in my living room. We're having a great time. We're laughing. We're having fun. And Travis looks over at me and he says, wow, I guess racism is stupid, isn't it? Yeah, I guess it is. Back to my grandfather. So he's at the bar, right? And this guy has a knife and the guy's getting ready to stab him. And he realizes that he is in a world of trouble. Now, on one hand, he has this guy with a knife who's getting ready to stab him. On the other hand, he is a black man who was passing as white in an all-white bar. So this isn't gonna work out well either way. Now, this was the 1930s, where a black man could get lynched and hung for just looking at someone funny. And the thing is, being in the South in the 30s, if you killed a black man, if you lynched a black man, nothing was gonna happen to you. You weren't gonna get in any trouble. And isn't it funny how the more things change, the more things stay the same? Now, my grandfather realized that he had to fight as well as he could and get out of there. So he goes to grab the knife, and he and the guy start struggling for the knife. And they're rolling around on the ground as the men in the bar stand there and watch them. And as they roll on the ground, my grandfather feels himself get the upper hand. And so he grabs the knife, and before he knows it, he's stabbing this guy. And as the guy lays on the ground dying, and as my grandfather waits for the sheriff to come and pick him up, he wondered how much longer he was actually going to be alive. So I was finding out all this information about the Arsenault side of the family. But the whole reason why I started doing Ancestry.com in the first place was to find out about the Kurkendaals. Yes, Kuykendall, Kurkendaals. But I was coming up after dead end after dead end after dead end until I meet my cousin John. Now, John lives in Indiana. And I'm going to be honest, when I found out the town that John lived in, I was definitely scared and I was definitely skeptical because it turned out that John actually lived in the part of Indiana that is, let's just say, very popular with the KKK. But I thought, you know what? I'll give him a call anyway, and let's see how this is gonna go. So I called John, and John couldn't have been nicer. And as we're talking, I asked him, how far do you live from Indianapolis? And it turns out he didn't live that far from Indianapolis. And so I tell him, you know what? In a few months, I'm gonna be in Indianapolis to perform at Indie Fringe. Hey, why don't you come to my show and we can hang out after? So cut to the day of the show. It's 15 minutes before the show and nobody's shown up yet. Now I had to get behind the scene and get ready. And so I go to the person taking the tickets and I say to her, hey, listen, so there's this guy who's gonna be coming to see my show. Now, I'm not sure what he looks like because I've never met him in person and the only picture I've seen of him is like really tiny. Now, I actually met him on Ancestry.com and he's a distant cousin. So if some guy comes up and says that his name is John and asks for a ticket, can you give him these tickets? So the person taking the tickets just gave me this weird look and I gave her the tickets and I ran backstage to get ready and I did my show. And after performing my show, I finished. And as I left from backstage, I walk up to the front of the theater and the ticket taker looks at me and says, I know what he looks like. And she brings me over and she introduces me to my cousin John and his partner, Jim. And I'm like, oh my God, I've got a gay cousin. Yes! So John, Jim, and I went out to lunch and we had a wonderful, wonderful afternoon. And so as we're talking and enjoying our lunch, we get one of the people at the neighboring table to take our picture. And this is our picture, John, Jim, and I. John is the very handsome man in the middle. Jim is the handsome man sitting next to him. And after we get our picture taken, the person asks us, oh, are you friends? And we both at the same time said, no, we're cousins. And the fact that I could sit at this restaurant with two cousins and have just a great time was wonderful. Two cousins of different colors, and it was no big deal. It should all be that easy. So, meanwhile, my grandfather gets taken away by the sheriff, and he's in the cop car driving to the station, and he was scared. He was very scared. Now, remember when I mentioned earlier about people, the phenomenon of people going and passing as white? It happened all the time, and it was way more common than you think. And like I said earlier, when families went and passed as white, a lot of times they ghosted the Black family that they left behind. So as Sheriff Kurkendaal, the white sheriff, is driving my grandfather to the jail, my grandfather had a glimmer of hope. Sheriff Kurkendaal looks in the rearview mirror and says to my grandfather, I know who you are, and I know we're related. And guess what, son? Today is your lucky day. I need you to do me a favor. and it's a big favor. And if you do this favor for me, I, in return, will do a favor for you. If you do this favor for me, we're going to take you to the jail. And at 12 o'clock, midnight, I will wake you up and I will take you in my car and I'm going to act like I'm taking you to the prison. When actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to the outskirts of town. And when we get to the outskirts of town, I'm going to let you out of this car and you are going to walk. And you are going to walk out of this town. And I never, ever want to see you in this town again. And if I do see you in this town again, I will shoot you on sight. Today was my grandfather's lucky day. Now, meanwhile, I meet another cousin, Shannon. Now, Shannon and I hit it off famously. She lived in New Orleans. Now, remember when I said that my dad was estranged from his family? This is how estranged my dad was from his family. So my dad and Shannon's mom grew up in the same house. Like they were cousins, but they literally grew up as siblings. But I had no idea that Shannon's mom or Shannon even existed. But once we met, we got along great. And so Shannon takes my husband and I out to this authentic New Orleans meal, and we're having fun and we're laughing and we're talking. And Shannon begins to tell me about my various relatives. Now, one of the relatives that she told me about that left this major impression on me was my Aunt Virginia. Now, this is the reason why my Aunt Virginia left an impression on me. Now, Aunt Virginia was an activist, and she was very involved with the Black community in New Orleans. She worked with, teaching kids to read, and she worked with encouraging Black women to get out and vote. And she worked with like Head Start programs, and just she was very, very involved. So when she passed away, they had her funeral. And at her funeral, the congregation noticed that there was a large group of white men wearing suits and sunglasses in the church. As a matter of fact, Shannon described it as kind of looking like the cast of Men in Black had infiltrated the church. So the reason why these white men were at her funeral was it turns out that they were the FBI. It turns out that my Aunt Virginia, otherwise known as Sister Abukari, was one of the founders of the Black Panthers in New Orleans. Like I said, bad ass. So I'm sitting there and my grandfather is talking, and at this point I am engrossed in this story. And my husband walks into the room and my husband tells us that it's almost time to go to breakfast. Now, I was a little worried about bringing my husband with me to meet my 99-year-old grandfather, but it actually was going well and he didn't seem to mind. Now, my grandfather did tell my husband, hey, you better be good to my grandson or you're gonna have me to deal with. And when he first said that, I thought, aw, that's so cute. That's what grandfathers say. But then after my grandfather's telling me the story about he killed a man, I thought, hey, maybe he means it. Now, my new step cousins were actually fascinated with my husband's British accent. And so he was basically there entertaining them. And as he walks into the room and asks me, what are you guys talking about? I just kind of looked back and said, I'll tell you later. But my grandfather stops mid-story and he looks at my husband for a second and he says, you favor my father. You look a lot like my father, which I was taken aback because my husband is pasty white with blonde hair and blue eyes. And my grandfather says, yeah, my father was German. What? This was news to me. And it turns out that my great grandfather on that side was German, spoke fluent German, and it was another piece to the puzzle. So my grandfather continues his story. So he's sleeping, it's 12 o'clock midnight, and he's rustled awake by Sheriff Kurkendaal. Sheriff Kurkendaal leads him to the car, and the cop car drives towards the outskirts of the city. When he gets to the outskirts of the city, he opens his door and he lets my grandfather out. And my grandfather left the town and continued to walk and smelled the fresh air of freedom. Now, I had another cousin, my cousin Lydia. Here she is, right here. Isn't she fabulous? She is fabulous. My cousin Lydia found out that I was doing the Ancestry.com thing, and so she got into the mix. So my cousin Lydia gave me a lot of paperwork, and it was a lot of paperwork that had to do with my ancestors on that side of the family who were Black people who actually fought in the Civil War, and they fought for the Union. And I'm going through paperwork and I'm seeing military cards and lists and just all sorts of things that have to do with fighting in the Civil War. And as I was looking through all this fascinating paperwork, I come up upon a ledger. So I'm looking at this ledger, and on the ledger is like the name of a person, and then there's like a little description next to it, and then there's like a $sign. And it reminded me a lot of when I used to work at a pet store back when I first moved to LA. Now, when we were at the pet store, we would get ledgers like this all the time. And as I look down this ledger, I realize that these were names of people. And these were names of people who were purchased. These were their purchasing records. And it really hit me. Wow. These people were treated like pets. They had no rights, they had no dignity, they had no nothing. They were not cared about, they were discarded. And for the first time, the aspect of slavery really hit home for me. You know, I'm used to watching shows like, Gone with the Wind and the television portrayal of slavery. 12 years a slave was no picnic, but it was nothing compared to actually seeing a ledger and seeing human names and seeing prices next to them. And it's something that is etched in my brain, and it is something that will always, always be etched in my brain. So back at my grandfather's house, he continues the story. He took advantage of his new freedom. And when he left that town, he turned his life around. He ended up being a war hero in World War II. It turned out that he was actually one of the oldest living African-American veterans. And so every year on Veterans Day, he would actually get his own float. But he looks at me as we're talking and he says to me, you know what? I can look at you and I can see that you remind me a lot of me. I can tell you're trouble. And you know what? I want you to stay that way. So I met one more cousin. As I look on the ancestry list, I see this person who lived in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I have a relationship with Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been performing in Minneapolis for like 20 years. I go to Minneapolis so much that people actually think that I live in Minneapolis. On more than one occasion, someone's called me up to ask me if I wanted to hang out, and they were surprised when I say I'm at home, and they say, well, yeah, that's why we're asking you to hang out. And I'm like, I'm at home in LA. And they're like, oh, we thought you lived here. So when my cousin Trey and I hooked up, I say to him, hey, we're definitely gonna meet. So Trey comes to pick me up, and when I get in the car, I have an audible gasp because Trey looked exactly like my sister's two sons, exactly. And I looked at him and I immediately knew that we were related. So we go for a pho meal on Eat Street in Minneapolis. And as we're sitting there eating our pho, I ask him, so how much do you know about our family? And he says, nothing. I don't know anything at all. And so I say to him, sit back and buckle up, because we have a lot of ground to cover, a lot. So at the end of that Christmas day, I left my grandfather's house a new man. But as we were leaving, I asked my grandfather, hey, wait a minute, you never told me. What was the favor that you did for Sheriff Kurkendaal? What was it? And my grandfather says, you know what I'm gonna do? Let's do this. I turn 100 years old in June. Why don't you come back for my 100th birthday? And when you come back, I'll tell you what the favor is. Deal. So guess what the favor was? I don't know. And you know why I don't know? Because a week after I left my grandfather, he passed away. My husband says that he thinks that my grandfather was just holding on, waiting to meet me, and by meeting me, he had no more unfinished business, and so he could go peacefully. I do wonder what that favor was, though, because what I forgot to tell you guys was the part of doing that favor was he was given $5,000 a year every year. Now, it was supposed to be for life, but he ended up outliving Sheriff Kurkendaal, so that was that. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'm sure the favor that he did was not good at all. But meeting my grandfather was very eye-opening to me. Learning about my family history was very eye-opening to me. Now, I realized, hey, you know what? Everybody has biases. I have biases too. But by learning that I have family members from literally every race, creed, and religion, it reminded me that, you know what? Racism is really fucking stupid, because at the end of the day, we're all related one way or another. Now I gotta tell you, like I said, when I wrote this show, I had no idea that it would be so timely. The shit that we're going through right now is stuff that my grandfather went through in the 30s. The stuff that we're going through right now was the stuff that my sixth great grandfather advocated against in like 1747. The shit is still going on. When are we gonna learn? When are we gonna get over this? It breaks my heart to see a Black man who just happens to be jogging and gets killed. You know what? I jog. That could have easily been me. Or a Black man who happens to get a counterfeit $20 bill and end up dying over it. You know what? One time I was given a counterfeit bill as well. That could have been me. You guys wouldn't believe how many times shit happens to me. You know, there was the time that I was walking outside drinking a Coke and I threw the Coke in the garbage can, and a policeman stops and accuses me of drinking. And his first question to me is, how long have you been on parole? Now, what he didn't know is I've been clean and sober for over 10 years, but I get accused of drinking. Or the time that my husband and I are driving home from a party in Palm Springs, and I'm driving the speed limit, and I get pulled over. And the reason I get pulled over is because the policeman tells me, you don't look like you belong here. When are we gonna learn? Thank you.